All right, we are back. We are live. We are functional, and we are drinking beer. Hi, this is Dave with the Florida Beer Media, FloridaBeerBlog.com, Florida Beer Podcast, Florida Beer Cruise. One of these years, I don't know. It's probably going to happen. But I don't have the Florida Beer book. But our author, or our guest today does. He's actually the author of 2 books, both of which, of course, I have. Both of which are slightly out of date. I guess it's a good thing to just go ahead and say that, which is fine because not only does he have books, that's a good way of putting it. But not only does he have books, he also has the site, which is in the middle of a big revamping. So we're going to chat with him about all of that. Mark DeNote, thank you so much. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me, Dave. Cheers.
Oh, cheers. Absolutely. And kind of what are you're drinking something fun there all the way over in
I work close to Gainesville, so I've got everything's backwards, so I'm not drunk, I promise. The Morning Ghoul from Swamphead, their Halloween series that they did, it's a vanilla chai blonde ale that's it's 5% is a nice easy drinking beer for right now. I'm a sucker for the cinnamon vanilla anything, but definitely the cinnamon vanilla. So it's a nice evening beer.
Yeah, it's funny. Exactly. And it's kind of funny that you mentioned that chai seems to come around every now and again. Doesn't have a big support.
No, I mean, in the coffee community,
there's more out there, but yeah.
In the coffee community likes it, and beer and coffee seem to go hand in hand more and more these days. So I like it.
Yeah. So you kind of mentioned the book, and you had been doing Florida beer news long before that. So let's actually go back to the beginning before we talk about all the new stuff that you have going on. Kind of start wanting to write about beer in the state of Florida, because you don't have to go that far back to where there really isn't a whole lot of anything to talk about.
Yep. Yeah. I'm a native Floridian. I've lived in Florida my whole life. I turned 21, and the first beer I ever had was Dunedin Brewery's Redhead Red Ale. And after that one, I actually told Mike Bryant the other day that was my first beer when I turned 21, and he was like, we got to talk about that. It's being a Floridian and being into beer. Back in the day, I got into trading beer because there was no beer. There was really no Florida beer. It was brew pubs only. And then beer wasn't my thing for a while. And then I discovered craft, got into more crafts, discovered Dogfish Head. Like so many of us, that was my gateway beer. I had a buddy from Maryland when I was a first-year teacher. He introduced me to it on Friday happy hours. And after Dogfish Chicory Stout, to 60-minute IPAs, to Belgians, to barley wines, to stouts, to sours, to just about everything. Now, I mean, beer's a great thing because there's an artistry to it, and so enjoying a beer, even if I don't like the beer. I mean, I'm not a huge smoked beer fan. I'm not a huge smoked porter fan. I'm not a huge. I wasn't a lager fan for a long time, but there's an artistry to it, and even if I don't personally like it. I've gotten to the point where I can appreciate most beers just for the sake of the brewer's intent and playing with different ingredients and the kind of the way the music of it all coming together.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, like you said, you were in the classroom, and then you decided to go ahead and start a website, which is kind of a funny story as to the first article that you had for the website, but kind of take us through that, why you decided this piece of news needed to be blasted and how you just sort of went down that rabbit hole, shall we say.
Sure. So back in the day, gosh, it was probably 2011, 2012. I was in the process of working on the book, and I was writing about Florida beer for odds and ends, different websites that wouldn't really pay or wouldn't, but it was for the love of writing and kind of paying my dues. And all all of a sudden Peg's Cantina started. Doug and his mom, they started doing growlers, and that was the beer that everybody would kind of make sure that they were there when they were. I mean, the people would travel from all over, from the Keys, from out of state to have barrel age day, or they were doing the Florida Weiss Bash, and all of a sudden they started deciding they were going to growler, and no one cared. All of a sudden, I mean, this brewery that everybody loved for whenever they released something, and they were making fantastic beer, and Doug was brewing at Cigar City, and they were doing some great just experimental stuff. I mean, you'd find some hop floaties in the beer every once in a while, and it was super fresh, unfiltered before it was cool. But no one in the national scene, no one in the big beer media pinged on their radar. And I had this idea of a Florida beer website, Florida beer news aggregator, after Beer Pulse or beernews.org at the time. I mean, he did such great work for a good long while, and then it kind of became too much for him. But I loved that idea. And Florida had probably 60 breweries at the time. They were just kind of they were starting to come out of the woodwork, and it was manageable to hit all the beers. Going off on tangents, I remember my buddy Barley Wine Dave and I used to go on road trips, and we went to the Miami beer scene, and we started in the Abbey, and we made it all the way up to Funky Buddha in an evening. And that was the Miami beer scene. And then the next day we tasted our way up to Cocoa Beach after a stop at Charlie and Jake's. Yeah. And I mean, there were like 8 breweries, and we could do it in 2 days. And that was the South Florida beer scene. Now it's insane how much it's exploded. But that was the beer scene back in the day, and being able to keep up with everybody, and being able to get the news and publish 3, 4, 5 articles a day sometimes. That was really doable when I was a teacher with I would get up early in the morning, I would aggregate everything, I would write at least 1 or 2 articles a day and publish that out, and those were the good old days. And then I wrote the book, and then a second book came from it, and after that we have what's that?
Which was the first book?
So the Florida beer book was the first one. That one took me about 3 years of researching and writing, and I wanted the history. I wanted to go back to the first brewery, and some very nice, very kind people helped me along the way. But that was the first book that had kind of collected all of the history from the different parts of Florida, because every chunk in the state up to Panhandle, Jacksonville, Tampa, Orlando, South Florida, everybody has kind of the 1 or 2 historic breweries, and you hear mentions of them, but nobody had collected that information to publish. And so that was where that book kind of, and still does serve its purpose to this day, I think.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you mention it as kind of a time capsule, because I think that with the speed of growth of the Florida craft industry, a lot of people don't really understand what was around and sort of where the stepping stones were. Just for example, I took a look, because in the middle, it's got a nice section of color photos. And literally the first 5 breweries that you have photos of are A1A Ale Works in St. Augustine, Bruzy in Boca Raton, Darwin's on 4th in Sarasota, Cask and Larder in Orlando, and the Funky Buddha Lounge in Boca Raton. And of those 5, only 1 still exists, which is interesting. And I guess that begs the question, is it the fact that Florida still is having a hard time as a state as a whole accepting a craft beer scene, or is it relative inexperience from the brewers in terms of running a business? Why do you think, just from what you've seen, that we still have a good amount of flux within the industry here?
That's an interesting question. I think what you're seeing in every beer area, and I would say you've got Jacksonville, you've got Tallahassee and the greater Panhandle, you've got Tampa, Orlando, Miami, and then Naples, Fort Myers. Everybody's in a different stage of, for lack of a better word, maturity. Everybody's in a different stage of growing their beer scene. So Tampa, you're seeing, I mean, to me, I see all the hallmarks of a very mature beer scene in Tampa, where you've got microcosms of English pub. You've got Wild Rover that does fantastic English ales. You've got the Independent and Mr. Dunderbox that have Germany and that have Belgians, and you've got Green Bench that's doing some wonderful sours, and then Cigar City that kind of set the standard for everybody, and Coppertail, and they've got a niche that they're doing well in, but everybody wants to diversify and play, and they all get together. That's the beautiful thing about Beer Week. It's a beautiful thing about so many of the collaborative opportunities. Even during COVID, everyone kind of tries to collaborate independently and stay safe, but there's the spirit of collaboration where everybody gets together for a beer afterwards or after work, and they bounce ideas off of each other, and they all make themselves better. And that's starting to happen. You're starting to see that kind of in Jacksonville, and Miami's getting big enough, although it's a hot spot. So some of that's COVID threw a wrench in everything. But before COVID, you're really starting to see the Tallahassee beer scene mature a great deal, even though there's probably still a decent amount of run room there. It's everybody's in their different phases of growing up as a beer scene. If you had told me 8 years ago, if you told me when I was writing my book that Naples Fort Myers would be brewing some of the beers that they're brewing, I would have told you you're crazy. But I mean, then I had OYA from Fort Myers Brewing, and that beer did exactly as promised, and I love that beer. I wish I could have it on tap at my house. It's just so citra forward and so wonderful. But this going from a guy who traded beers, who had nothing to trade, to a guy when Cigar City opened, when Coppertail opened, when some of these breweries, and Florida got on the national stage pretty much overnight. I mean, the fantastic beer just started falling from the heavens. So I was fortunate I was able to trade and score a lot of really cool beers from around the country, to the point now, fast forward to 2020, 2021, I don't trade hardly at all. I mean, there's a few breweries I have my finger on the pulse because they're just making such outstanding beer, but Florida, I can get pretty much anything I want from this state, from a really mature barrel-aged sour all the way to a Keller beer, to the lightest of the light, to the darkest of the dark, to the most time-intensive and barrel-aged. And Calusa just released the beer that was aged for, I think, 1.5 to 2 years in barrels. I mean, to the darkest, deepest, booziest stout. Florida's got somebody that's got everything, and it's really it's awe-inspiring seeing where we were. And that's why I think, I know I'm biased because it's my labor of love, my baby, but the book from 2014, the Florida book, really does serve as a time capsule, to the point now where I'm running into the same problem. If I tried to write another book, the hardest part of it is trying to cap it off and say, at one point we were opening 2 breweries a day nationwide. And it seemed like while we were talking, another one opened. So keeping up with all of them and introducing myself and kind of making the rounds, it's impossible anymore. There was a time where I could say I'd been to every brewery in the state. And now some of those breweries have 2, 3, 4 locations.
Yeah, exactly.
So.
It's interesting in terms of the growth. It's interesting that you sort of mentioned this, because it seems like a lot of breweries aren't necessarily going for the big regional image like Cigar City and Funky Buddha did. What it seems instead, they are going for multiple locations. And I'll use Motorworks, for example. Obviously, they've got their gorgeous one-of-a-kind facility in Bradenton, but they just opened up on Lake Eola in what used to be an old Panera Bread, right there on the corner, right behind Howard Middle School. And so you've got them, down in West Palm Beach, Fran Andrulovich, he had opened Tequesta Brewing, and then from there opened up 2 other breweries, Steam Horse and Twisted Trunk. The list goes on and on. Obviously, Bold City has 2 locations. Big Top is up to 3? I think. Yeah,
and in Pensacola, which is kind of a
yeah. So it's interesting that you're starting to see that sort of growth in terms of having multiple locations, but still keeping it within the state of Florida.
Well, I think you see that example in other markets where, like Sierra Nevada has the Torpedo Room up in a different part of California, where it's an outstretch of outreach of their culture. And I think that's the mark of a, maybe not a mature. It doesn't mean that you're a mature brewery. Not to say that they're not, but it's something where you can kind of extend that taproom feeling. Because I love craft beer bars and I love brewery tasting rooms, and there are two very distinct feels to each of them. And there's nothing. I mean, my beer education came, God rest his soul, to Tony Falso at the Oldsmar Tap House. I wouldn't be into any half the beers that I learned about. I learned from him, and everybody needs that place, that safe space, that home where you can ask stupid questions about beer, where you can say things that you know everybody else around you knows, but nobody's going to judge you because you're asking a question about malt or hops or yeast, or you don't understand what's different between a Belgian this and a Belgian that. And I think that there's a place for each of them, but trying to extend that to as many people as possible only helps beer culture, only helps craft beer in the end.
Awesome. And so you got the website going. It's been going very strong for several years. And then recently you decided to sort of take it in a new direction. And what was that direction? What was sort of the impetus behind that?
So, Florida beer has been expanding so rapidly that it's difficult to cover everything, but there's a space for commentary on the greater beer scene in the country. And what I found, largely as a freelance writer and somebody who wants to contribute to the overall dialogue about beer in the country, was that I was getting turned down by a lot of publications, by a lot of magazines, because I wasn't writing about national. I was only writing, or was my specialty. And so what I decided was I wanted to kind of write in comments about beer on the larger environment. And Florida Beer News wasn't, I still want to run Florida Beer News. Florida is my home. It's near and dear to my heart, but BeerWise, I wanted to start a podcast. I wanted to start doing something greater and contributing to the larger conversation about beer. And so what BeerWise allows me to do is to do just that, to write commentary about beer, to write articles for the neophyte in the beer scene to the beer geek veteran who's been around for a while and wants to argue with me. I can do both. And so I wanted kind of a home for that content, because it didn't feel at home in Florida Beer News, because it wasn't necessarily just related to Florida. But then I didn't want to displace the Florida news, because I think there's still an important piece to that. So what I'm trying to do now is to get the beerwise.org set up as an independent site to Florida Beer News. And at one point there was a thought to transition one into the other, but the more I thought about it, the more Florida really deserves its own space, because it's my home, because it is so special, but also because there's no reason why the two can't coexist. And so I have one overarching company called Barrel Age Media that's going to run both of them, and welcome guest writers and spots, and just try and promote the greater beer awareness, greater beer conversation, because there's so much to be said about beer, even in the Black is Beautiful beer, and in the strange moment we find ourselves in, with beer as an opportunity to unite people, and beer as an opportunity to have a greater conversation. Because one of the coolest things that's kept me in beer, that I absolutely love about craft beer, is that craft beer affords the opportunity in any place at any time. If you're drinking a beer, even to a perfect stranger who is politically polar opposite, I can look and say, "What are you drinking?" and start a conversation about beer that is apolitical, that is nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with any of the things that divide people. And we can sit there and have kind of this human moment, this separate moment. And I can have that with anybody in a beer space, in a beer bar, that I can't do in a sports bar, I can't do in any other environment. But when you introduce craft beer, that's possible where it never was before.
That's kind of amazing. And it's interesting that you mentioned politics because this year seems to be we are opening something fun. What are we opening?
The Black is
We just
Beautiful.
opened something.
The
Black is beautiful.
sideward.
Beautiful. Sideward version variant thereof. But you said it's interesting that you mentioned politics because covering the Florida craft beer scene, you've been through a lot of the politics. You've seen some of these changes go through. We'll mention the 64-ounce growler debacle and obviously the current issues that are affecting Florida craft beer and whether they get changed or not changed, as the case may be up in Tallahassee. Have you seen, obviously taking a look at us and taking a look at the rest of the state or rest of the country, do you say that the laws here for craft beer in the state of Florida, that we're still behind the times when it comes to most states? Are we making progress? Kind of how have you seen that? And with the brewers, how do they feel as they talk to you?
It's an interesting conversation. The kind of 600-pound gorilla is self-distribution. So we could take that one on. And there's a number of other ones that are interesting. I've done work with distributors. I've done work with retailers. I've done work with breweries. And self-distribution is a multifaceted issue that the only way I see it getting solved and see progress moving forward is I've spoken with at conferences. I've spoken with other brewers guilds and from other states. And the best idea I've heard about that is to sit down in a room with no preconceived notions and just have a conversation and just ask the distributors, where is the line in the sand and how do we both get something out of this? I think that it's a much larger issue. It's kind of like 64-ounce growlers. It looks like a one side versus the other, where it's really, there are 5 different sides, each with different agendas who are kind of competing. And until sometimes you don't even know who you're arguing against. And it's a very, I don't see progress being made until there's that sit down conversation. Politically, I think the state has a number of factions. The brewers may be united together, but the distributor lobby has several factions. And and when you start messing with retailers, there's the Green Monster that has their lobby. Not to say that they're for or against anything, but there's always these kind of corners that when you start going into someone's corner politically, then you are affecting their agenda, and that's difficult. The best way to make progress is to have that conversation, and not to meet in the legislature and the first time you hear something is a bill. So gosh, there's so many. What issue was on your mind when you asked that question? Because I'll go off on tangents and you got to keep me focused.
Well, I'm lucky enough that I've been working with Pete Anderson from Paradolia Brewing about trying to get people to understand the different laws that are affecting craft beer. And kind of the 2 big ones that we were looking at that I think everybody's looking at is self-distribution and franchise reform. And through some of the interviews that I've had on the Florida Beer podcast, it looks like previously in past years, they've sort of tried to pass the 2 together. And it was the franchise reform that got the distributors kind of concerned, shall we say. Mm-hmm. So I think for the coming year, the people that are going back, if they do get reelected, are going to try and pass just a self-distribution bill.
In terms of self-distribution and franchise reform, in working with distributors for as long as I have, and I do a fair amount of work with distributors. That's one of my day jobs that I work. The thing that a lot of breweries don't understand about distributors is that they're out at 2, 3, 4 in the morning delivering beer. It seems like that they do a lot of just delivery and logistics, but the sweat equity that they put into the brand, not to say that brewers don't, but there's a lot gets lost in translation. And that's why I say that sit down conversation really has to happen. Because I think the brewers have a line in the sand, just like the distributors do, where if the distributors went after tasting rooms, and went after and politically decided that one day you shouldn't be able to operate a tasting room, I think that would be a non-starter for the brewers as well. But there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more to distribution than just delivering beer. On the self-distribution side and on the franchise reform side, I've heard the story told many times where the whole reason why the franchise law exists is because back in the day, Miller and Bud were threatening to pull their products from the distributors. So what if you're a Bud distributor that can't distribute Bud? And certain companies that are very aggressive, shall we say, decided that they would threaten distributors to pull their product. And so the one of the big reasons why that franchise law was created was to prevent the big brewers, without naming one particular name, to prevent that big brewer from pulling his brands, threatening distributors, and making them not independent anymore. And that's actually a great story because there's some distributors who had to go to bat against August himself, who went into the governor's office and sat down and told them on the way out, "You're done. There's no way this bill will pass." And Bob Martinez is from Tampa, and the Tampa group sat down with him, had a conversation, and he signed the bill. And the franchise made it, and so that took that dulled a lot of the teeth that the big brewers had, where if beer's allocated, if beer is supposed to go one place, distributors are independent, and they can say, you know what, we don't want to do that. And there may be repercussions later, but distributors have to be independent. And there's so many new ideas for distribution. I mean, every time I look on Facebook and Twitter, there's a new distributor. There's somebody I just bought 3-4 packs of Other Half from New York, because there's, I think it was Sunshine State or one of the independent distributors decided to reach out to the brewery and bring that beer down here. And I mean, you had to pay a hefty premium, but we got Other Half that was 2 weeks old, 3 weeks old.
Nice.
It's crazy. And when Hunapu Day was here, and Hunapu Day got canceled, those kegs went everywhere. And so, but it's because of that tier. And I know that tier is not perfect, and I know that everybody has their issues, but this is such a hydra. This issue has so many different heads and so many different opinions, and we're over 300 breweries, and we have, I want to say, upwards of mid-20s, low 30s distributors in Florida, and everyone kind of has their own ideas and agendas, and it's going to take, it's easy to boil it down and make it a black and white, whereas it's as gray as it could possibly be.
Nice.
And I know that's not the fun, sexy answer of finding the bad guy and
no. No, it makes perfect sense. Absolutely. I kind of want to get back to BeerWise though, because one of the things that you did mention is that you started a podcast, and as the second best Florida-based beer podcast that's out there.
We'll get there.
Kind of. No, you won't. No.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I guess what was the purpose behind the podcast? What sort of inspired you to do that? And with that, what is your vision for it? What are the kind of voices that you're going to expect to have on the show?
My vision for that, and I appreciate the plug there, because I realize I'm on a podcast talking about a podcast. So I mean, that's really cool that you give me this leeway.
Of course.
The vision for the podcast is just to give craft beer, to give more of craft beer a voice, because pre-COVID, we're at 8,000 plus breweries with 11,000 permits nationwide. Jeez. And so I mean, honestly, there are a number of podcasts too. I mean, there's probably a couple hundred of those, but even with all of that, we can't get to everybody. And I think I've been meaning to do this for a long time. And James Blankenfeld became, I worked with him on the Tampa Bay beer documentary. Not to say that I did anything as meaningful as what he did. he killed it. I mean, he really did a fantastic job. But just in talking to him, I had to kick myself in the butt because I've been meaning to do this for a while. And just like Florida Beer News, I get in my own head and I spin things up and I have 1,000 what ifs, and I'll go down all these rabbit holes, and then meanwhile, nothing will get done. And if I've learned anything in all the years I've been alive, I know myself that well. And so I just had to start. And it's the old adage of, you build the plane as you fly it. And so there are, I mean, my first podcast wasn't fancy. It was me getting to know things and learning to host, because there's certainly an art to it. You got to keep the guest on task, and you got to ask your questions, and you have a time format, and there's all that fun stuff. But there are people and podcasts that really make it easy, that make it look really easy. And I learned that it's not. And, kudos to yourself and to all the podcast hosts out there, because it's a lot of prep, and it's a lot of sweat equity, and it's doing it, making the podcast on your own time, and putting your own love into it. But something really great and really, really necessary and really artful can come out of it. And I think that's kind of where I want to be. And I want to talk to, I think Florida is such a powerhouse that I can have guests from the state, but once we start traveling again, I'm very blessed and to have a job where I do travel a fair amount. And so to bring my podcast equipment with me and talk to people, and even to do it over Zoom, I'm fortunate to have very robust internet. And so, I mean, my biggest worry is sound. And as long as I can keep control of that, I'm happy. So, why not try and get as many people as possible? And have them talk about beer, have them talk about what's going on in their world, and go see what's going on. BeerWise, that's where the name came from. But there's a much wider conversation, and there's also some, after listening to a few beer podcasts, and not trying to bash anyone, just it wasn't for me. There are a lot of podcasts out there that I didn't find appealing, and I thought that there could be a kind of more professional voice given to it. That's something I wanted to try, and if the reception is there, then great, I'll keep doing it. I've invested in the equipment, and after that, it's an investment of my time, and what could go wrong sitting around talking about beer and breweries, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So, so thank you so much for coming on the show. I do appreciate it. Since we were talking about breweries, I do want to ask your question, and I'll leave you with this, because obviously people know Funky Buddha, people know Cigar City, people know the big players. What, in your mind, are some of the best unknown breweries here in the state?
It evolves. It evolves and changes all the time, and everybody has their strengths. That being said, Ron Rake at Playa Linda Brewing is a flippin' genius. That man he's been brewing in the state for forever, and if I live over on the Tampa side, but man, if I live closer to Titusville, I would be a regular there. And at Tampa, Magnanimous Brewing just opened. Those are some fantastic brewers, fantastic people. Calusa Brewing in Sarasota. I mean, the guy from Don't Drink Beer was there for Tampa Bay Beer Week, and they're gaining some momentum, but they're absolutely killing it. Love to go there every time I'm down that way, and I've stopped by 99 Bottles in Sarasota, and then right on to Calusa. Just going to Fort Myers Brewing. I talked about their IPA. I really enjoy them. Coppertail. Every time I go there, they're kind of the other Cigar City. They haven't quite gotten there yet. Tampa Bay Brewing is killing it. Dunedin Brewing has some great traditional ales. I love going there and the history. Intuition and Ardwolf in Jacksonville. Love to go there. And then Karate in the Garage. Southern Swells is doing some great beers too. The Jacksonville beer scene is growing in leaps and bounds. Tallahassee. Ology always has something I want to try. Even if it's just their standard West Coast IPA, which post-COVID, I've been really digging West Coast IPAs again. and Ologies was fantastic. They're doing coffee, they're doing distilling, they're doing everything. They're deep. If I'm in Tally, I'm going to go see Ryan and see what crazy stuff he's coming up with. His new seltzer and his tan in a can, and just his stout game is really solid. If I'm going to Panhandle, I'm hitting McGuire's for the history. Really the first brewery, the first brew pub. They're the oldest in the state. Shh, don't tell anyone. The incredible experience. The bathrooms have weird signs. It's a hoot and a half. And then going back down the Tampa side, I mean, Tampa's breweries are, I can't say enough good things about. That was the scene where I grew up. Orlando, Sideward, really enjoyed their beers. Who else? I always forget Orlando because they're kind of the late comer to the game. Broken Strings, I've tried a few of theirs and they're pretty solid. After that, breweries are sprouting up everywhere. Infinite Ale Works in Ocala, fantastic, one of the best quads I've had in a long time. In the West Floridian, which is a pun on West Valerian, which I think is hilarious. And Swamphead, every time I go through Gainesville, I mean, I'm biased, of course, but Swamphead, their space is phenomenal. And they've been releasing like 4 or 5 beers a week since COVID hit. Their Halloween series, everything's going into cans now, and they've got a drive-through, and really enjoy their First Magnitude in Gainesville. Their Hefeweizen it's awesome. I will always get a 6-pack of that. Who else? I mean, I could go on. I could go on forever.
Yeah.
But there's so many good beers in the state, and I'm a stout fanatic too. So CCB and Zukov and Germans. Mr. Dunderbox has his own brewery now, so his hef is awesome, and he's got a Belgian sour that he does iterations of that's out of this world. I mean, Tampa is even broken into sections where Angry Chair's game is amazing. Seventh Son's game and Stouts is amazing. They have a coffee company now. Hidden Springs is right there, and their stout game is pretty solid. Ulele, the food beer in the Sunset. I mean, I'll just mention it seems like I'll just mention every brewery in Tampa, St. Pete, and then we'll say Cycle and Greenbench, and Greenbench, Sunshine City. Which is available which I can go to my grocery store in Brooksville and buy, which, God bless America. We can get the quality craft beers here. Cycle is in my grocery store, where they used to be draft only. And you can go to Cycle and they've got these beers that people used to line up for and get in fistfights over. And they've got boxes of them behind the counter that you can sit and enjoy in the bar and just watch St. Pete. It's the greatest time to be a beer lover. I mean, you can go just deep dive in so many different breweries. With they've got the right around the corner. They got an arcade bar. It's for someone who used to drive an hour to the only local brewery, which was Cigar City. I can't imagine better right now, because there's always something new to discover, always something new to have fun with and try. And even if I don't like it, see what the brewer was going for. It's awesome.
Awesome. Well, Mark DeNote, thank you so much for coming on the show. The website is beerwise.org, which is going to be coming up. The podcast is available pretty much anywhere, right? Yeah.
Yep. All the major podcast outlets. The first episode is up. The second episode is coming soon. Got a recording hopefully next week, and it'll be up shortly thereafter. Finding guests and then editing, it's always a fun challenge.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Next week is going to be a little fun. We're going to go ahead and ignore beer completely, and we're actually going to be heading down sort of in your neck of the woods to Tarpon Springs, and we're going to be talking to Tarpon Springs Distilling. They are the only people in the state of Florida making ouzo, and if you don't know what ouzo is, buckle up, because it's one of the best liquors that have ever been available. This has been a production of Florida Beer Media. You can find us at floridabeermedia.com, floridabeerblog.com. The Florida Beer Podcast is available anywhere fine podcasts can be found, and I've got a couple interviews that I have lined up for that one for the next episode coming out this weekend. Go ahead and enjoy, and we will see you next week with Tarpon Springs Distilling. Drink Florida Craft, everyone. Have a great day.